Good morning. It is great to be here. The 20th anniversary of CBI, Community Building Initiative. It's not drinking age yet, but over these 20 years, CBI has done such important work, as you have heard already, and I want to thank Felicia McDowell for the invitation to come and to Diane English for your years of dedicated leadership of CBI. I wasn't nervous until Jared spoke and put a little pressure on me, and then Tracy followed up. Today I'm going to maybe do less of a speech and more perhaps of a meditation on what I think are some of the most critical issues, not just Charlotte faces, but any community faces at this point in our country's history. One of the big challenges that I see from place to place around America, and certainly here, is our collective unwillingness to hold ourselves up to the mirror. You know, the old story about Narcissus, who just looked into the water and saw his own image and saw the image that he loved, prevented him from seeing a little bit of what else was there. There's a certain vanity that I think we live with that makes us justify the world as we see it, as we know it. It makes it more difficult for us to understand the warts. It's hard to hold a mirror up to an entire community because depending on what part of that community you live in or work in or play in or experience your faith in, you can see something different. And it is so important that CBI has worked diligently over the last 20 years to give us a common place to discuss these vantage points that we bring to this community. But it's gotten to an existential crisis, I would say, now, a crisis of identity. And I want to maybe talk a little bit about this community as I know it. You see, I was born in 1971. Tracy, you work for American Airlines, and so in that year we had fewer than 1 million employments in the city. I think the most recent counts were 43 million, so we've grown a little bit. But I was born just a few days after the U.S. Supreme Court declared busing as a legitimate form of school desegregation. The case originated right here in Charlotte and was argued by Julius Chambers. My grandparents were educators, and they had taught largely in their careers in the formerly segregated schools. In fact, my grandfather had been a principal at Old Reed High School in Belmont. He lost that job partly because the schools were being desegregated. And over the next few years, both he and my grandmother ended up teaching in middle schools, my grandfather teaching up at Alexander Junior High in Huntersville. They understood these sacrifices as sacrifices, but they also saw those sacrifices as a pivot point towards progress. Because in their minds, no longer would their children or their grandchildren be relegated to secondhand books or secondhand uniforms or secondhand facilities. all signals that the larger society gave to them and their children that they were inferior. No, their children and grandchildren would inherit a world where they would get the same things that white children got. You know, it wasn't all peace and quiet when that decision got handed down. There was unrest in Charlotte and even on some of our school campuses, where in other parts of Charlotte, folks said, well, you mean my children are going to go to school with those children? It took a mountain of a man, or rather a man from the mountains, C.D. Spangler, to enter himself into the fray, and as a candidate for school board. Not only did C.D. Spangler appoint Leroy Pop Miller, a former assistant principal at West Charlotte High School in the segregated days, to become the principal at East Mecklenburg, which was a formerly all-white school, but he himself sent his daughters to the formerly all-black West Charlotte High School, and it sent a signal. If one of the richest people in all of America could send his daughters to a formerly all-black high school, then other people could too. These actions put in motion a context in which I grew up, neither fearing nor falsely elevating my white counterparts. I could at least understand myself as an equal, to a point. You see, one rung on the ladder of understanding for me was realizing that I had as much intellectual capacity as the next person, that my blood was red just like the next person, that their needs and wants were the same as mine. And as I think about it, though, the one thing I never felt as a child was powerful. I felt like I had a slim margin of error. And while I played within that margin for the most part, there were times when I did test it. I used to play basketball over at the Central YMCA. It's now called the Dowd. And the After Five group included a number of Charlotte-Mecklenburg police officers, including an officer named Randy Stitt. These guys were great. They would ask me about how I was doing in school. They talked to me about basketball and different moves. They marveled at my gorilla dunks. I don't know why that was funny. But to make a long story short, fast forward a little bit, I'm 15 years old. I just get my learner's permit. And one of my good friends, Scott Culpepper, invited me to drive his old beat-up Citation that had power steering, but there was no power steering. So I get behind the wheel of this car. He's got his license, so I'm like, it's not okay, but I thought it was okay. We're going down Monroe Road, and the car is swerving from left to right, to left to right, to left to right. And sure enough, blue lights start to appear in the rearview mirror. Or they would have if he'd had one. Actually, there was side mirrors. Oh, before I know it, we'd been pulled over. I'd never been pulled over before. I was nervous. The officer had a flashlight and started to walk over to the driver's side and spoke in very authoritative tones, and I couldn't imagine what to say, and so I started freaking out. I just said, "What did I do wrong? Just tell me what I did wrong." And it sounded to the officer as if I was being aggressive to the officer. The officer told me to shut up, which frustrated me even more. Things got escalated. Scott, who is white, gave me the talk. You know the talk. Like, calm down, say yes, sir, et cetera, et cetera. Well, by now, there are 4 or 5 police cars that have converged into this area. And then I look backwards, and I see these cars pull up and these officers huddled around. The officer who had approached me is flailing his arms in frustration. And then a different figure walks up towards the vehicle. And when I saw the face of the person who showed up, it was Randy Stitt. He told me that he had to calm his colleague down and that I should calm down, that I would probably get a warning ticket, and that I probably shouldn't drive that car anymore. I decided 2 things right then and there. First, I decided that community policing really works. Had I not been playing basketball at the Central Y, had I not gotten to know Randy Stitt, had he not gotten to know me, had he not been, just by happenstance, one of those cars that pulled up, what in the world might have happened to me at that time? The second thing I decided was that I was going to be the U.S. Secretary of Transportation. I point this story out because I know what people feel about the criminal justice system and its unfairness specifically to African Americans. I understood it as mayor, and I understood it when I watched our city on fire in September of 2016. While incidentally, I was attending a transportation summit in Japan. What struck me, despite all of our history, locally and nationally, was how easily our frustrations can be understood in the context of protest, and how difficult, on the other hand, it is for those same frustrations, concerns, and hopes and aspirations to be understood in the context of making policy. The Beatties Ford Road Corridor, the part of the city that I grew up in, has been in rough shape for a long time. As a city councilman and as mayor, I did work to represent the entire community. And I can point to things in every part of the city that I was part of in the chain of decision making. But I took a deep interest in trying to figure out how to turn that particular corridor around, because I believe that if we could find one area of our city to reinvent, that it would make a statement to us and to the world about the capacity of this great city to include people, to lift up communities. So we passed neighborhood bonds. And I remember talking to Ike Hurd Sr. and his neighbors in the McCrory Heights community who had been promised sidewalks for 50 years, who finally got those sidewalks. We looked at crime statistics and realized that the corridor was one of the few in the city that did not have a police substation, so we put a police substation in place to tackle crime. We worked with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Development Corporation to put a business park off of Roswell's Ferry Road where the Mecklenburg County Bar now sits. These things happened not sort of in isolation from each other, but these were parts of a coordinated effort to tackle the challenges this corridor faced. But it was really interesting to me that when we started talking about trying to connect that corridor to fixed rail transit, all hell broke loose. It's a streetcar to nowhere, some said. We're taking it out of order, others said. It's a waste of money, still other people said. And I wanted to say, and often did, why don't we just listen to what we're saying here? Is what we really want in this city a fixed rail system for some and buses for others? Have we even begun to think about the role transportation can play as a catalyst for transit-oriented development, for creating and reinventing a corridor that for generations we've let die on the vine? We put a bridge over I-485 in Ballantyne. We built farm-to-market roads in the university area and extended light rail. What is our answer for East and West Charlotte? You see, I believe, perhaps optimistically, that there is enough wealth and ingenuity and good-hearted people and smart folks and need for the private sector to join the city in reinventing the Beatties-Ford Road corridor. And in doing so, showing ourselves and the broader world that this city is serious about tackling its problems. It's not just a matter of transportation. It's a matter of building a sustainable community and access for all. We were trying at that time to piece together an affirmative theory of community, one that could propel us into a future of shared prosperity and growth. It was a variation of the same affirmative theory that motivated Julius Chambers to do what he did and C.D. Spangler to do what he did. And by the way, do you see any markings around the city that celebrate these two remarkable people? They deserve to be remembered for what they did. So, I'm almost done with my meditation. It's still in process here. I had a chance 2 years ago to go visit Cape Coast in Ghana. This is one of those areas along the western coast of Africa where captives were conditioned to go into slavery. You know, I'd read about slavery in textbooks, and I've been to Charleston and Annapolis and some of the catchment areas for the transatlantic slave trade, but I had never been on the African side of that. Can't imagine a father being captured along with his wife and child, chained at the ankle and the arm, marched into a fortress, and in the middle of this fortress, this stock, was mentally conditioned for what they were about to experience. They were stripped. Women were assaulted. Men might have been shot in a vain effort to protect them. It was psychological warfare. These people, despite maybe the images we have, these were not passive people. Some of them even jumped off of the boats leading to the ships that were to carry them to other parts of the world, rather than live a life of captivity. Families were broken up. The father might have ended up in the West Indies. The child might have ended up in Charleston, and still another family member might have been in South America. And it was so grotesquely inhumane that records were barely kept. We don't know the names. We don't even know how many people were sold into slavery. And in the early parts of our republic, it was one of the most fundamental pillars of our economy. And in fact, many of the iconic structures we look at today, the White House and the Capitol, were built by slave labor. You know, it's easy to say these things don't matter anymore, or that this history is disconnected from where we are today. And then I look at Ferguson and Staten Island in Baltimore, and even here in Charlotte, and even in Charlottesville. This history is still with us. We're not confined to it. We can rise above it. But it is only by looking at it in the mirror and understanding how we've gotten to where we are and how much farther we have to go that we can even begin to get to the place that CBI is ultimately trying to take us. So, how do we deal with all this? Now that I've gotten you guys all cheered up, how do we deal with this? Let me offer 3 ideas. First, and I love this community, by the way, so this is coming from love. First, Charlotte needs to stop worrying about what the world thinks of it. We need to focus more on what we think of ourselves. And I say this because when a community's reputation is so fragile, it almost by definition makes protest the most effective way to gain action. You know, if you're so worried about what the rest of the world thinks about you, you're asking for protests instead of engaged dialogue and action based on a democratic process. I know Harvard is a good school. I've heard that. But why did it take Harvard University to tell us that we had an income mobility challenge? Where has our conscience been? And why did those who were telling us to focus on this issue for years and years and years, why were they not heard? I love this city, make no mistake, but it harbors an insecurity about itself that actually is a threat to its future. We can't allow those insecurities to override our self-awareness. Let me give you an example. We did this Smart City Challenge at USDOT, And it was a challenge that challenged cities to use technology in transportation, basically. Well, Columbus was a self-aware city. And one of the things they were self-aware about was that their infant mortality rate was 4 times the national average. It was a source of community concern before the challenge started. But what Columbus did with the challenge was they decided there's a way to use this challenge to help us solve a problem we already know we have. So they identified an area of Columbus with a high infant mortality rate. And they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to create an app that will allow mothers to schedule their doctor's appointments online. And that app will also, at the same time, generate a transit trip so the mom can get there. And you know, if the bus is late, the app is going to tell the doctor's office that it's late and it's going to work to reschedule that appointment for mom. And by the way, if mom doesn't have a smartphone, we're going to put kiosks in that neighborhood so that she can have the same access that someone who has a smartphone has. It's a pretty good idea. And Columbus ultimately won the Smart City Challenge. But I point that out to say that when you're self-aware and you're making decisions, there are creative ways that you can solve problems if you're looking for them. The second point, and this is not unique to Charlotte, this is unique to America. We have an intensely difficult challenge. We have a different challenge than Norway has. Because we have people from all over who look different, who pray differently, who think differently. I mean, we have a lot of diversity, and frankly, the country's undergoing what demographers are calling the great sorting. As we become browner and younger and all these things, it changes the consciousness of the individual. It's no longer black and white. We're Asian, we're Latino, we're men and women, we're straight, we're gay, we're lesbian, we're transgender, we're queer, we're rich, we're middle class and poor, we're urban and suburban and rural. We're all of these things. When I ran for mayor the first time, I hired a consulting group that had deep experience getting African Americans elected to mayor in majority white cities. They sat me down and they said, look, we got to tell you something. I said, what? First, we want to tell you you're black. It's like, I feigned a look of surprise. Second, white voters are going to be concerned about 2 things. Are you soft on crime? And are you going to raise their taxes? And third, you will never win a majority of white men, so don't even try. That last bit was a piece of advice I actually ignored. It turned out to be statistically true, but I ignored it. And I point this out because I think in some ways we're looking for politics to solve problems that we ourselves have as a culture. Politicians aren't going to solve this for us, folks. We have to sit side by side, neighbor by neighbor, friend by friend, and build the kind of coalitions and the kind of society we want to live in. And I can promise you that when that is demanded by the people, it will be the culture of our politics again. The last bit of advice that I have is that we have to try. Now that sounds simple, but in this world where you have limited time and you got pressure, you got to get to work, you got to do all this other stuff, the concept of trying things that may not work sounds crazy. But I look at heroes that I see in this community who are trying every day, and I can tell you that without effort, we can't get where we need to go. We just have to try. Pamela Grundy is a Charlotte-Mecklenburg school parent who is in the trenches every single day. She's literally willing schools like Shamrock Gardens Elementary to be better schools. Gene Winchester and Woody Daniels over at the Fourth Ward Barbershop started this concept of cops and barbers, bringing together the community and the police to engage in dialogue even before September of 2016. Davidson College President Carol Quillen, as has been noted, has bravely launched an effort to explore my alma mater's connection to slavery. These are just some examples of what folks can do where you are. I guess the best way I could sum it up would be to take some words from Julius Chambers. It's a great book on him Richard Rosen has written. But he cites a point right after the 71 desegregation case when someone who was dissatisfied with the outcome of that case wrote to Chambers. And Chambers took the time to write back to this person. And this is what he said. He said, "I think the plan of desegregation in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools is essential not only for children, black children, but white children as well, who must learn to work and play together." My Kindle is slow, sorry. If we had the ideal situation where the black and white citizens in this community had been free to live, to purchase homes and work according to their own choosing, desegregation would not be an issue, nor would the busing of students. The objective in the school case was to provide, hopefully, a beginning of free access to blacks of the great opportunity that America affords. Perhaps your children and mine, with the transportation now required, can begin to look and view each other as human beings with faults, problems, hopes, and aspirations no different from others. Maybe that objective will never be accomplished. I think it is at least worth a try. And I know it would not have been possible under the school assignment practices of the past. This, I think, is ultimately the challenge we have. It's not to sit still and be content. It's not to accept divisions as divisions. It's not to think about this community as static, but one that is dynamic and growing and continuing to need the air of people and neighbors and conversations. That's what CBI has been doing for 20 years. And the challenge we face today is taking those conversations into the halls of government, into our boardrooms, into our homes, and building a better community. Thank you.